A soldier came to conquer a village, but was defeated by the silence of one woman. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories inspired by history and human courage. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Today's story takes us back to a cold winter during the Second World War, when one man came as a conqueror and left as a broken believer in peace. Let us return now to our main characters. The wind rolled through the narrow streets of a small French village, carrying with it the smell of smoke and frozen earth. The war had drained every color from the town. Only gray walls, boarded windows, and fear remained. Inside one of the old stone houses, a fire burned weakly in the hearth. An elderly man sat beside it, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages of a worn book. Across the room, his niece sat sewing by the dim light of an oil lamp, her face pale but calm. Then came the sound they dreaded, the low growl of an engine outside, followed by boots crunching on gravel. The old man's hand froze mid-turn. The girl looked toward the door, her eyes steady but filled with silent dread. 3 heavy knocks echoed through the house. When the door opened, a tall man stood framed by the winter light. He wore the uniform of a German officer, his long coat dusted with snow, his cap held politely in his hand. His voice, calm and deep, broke the silence. "Good evening," he said in careful French. "I am Lieutenant Werner von Ebernock. I have orders to stay here during the occupation. I hope my presence will cause you no distress." The old man did not rise. The girl did not move. The only sound was the soft crackle of firewood. After a long pause, the officer gave a small nod, as if acknowledging an invisible wall. "I understand," he said quietly. "I will take the room upstairs. I will not disturb you." He stepped inside with military precision, placing his suitcase neatly by the stairs. The faint scent of cold air and leather lingered in the hall. As his footsteps disappeared above, the old man exhaled slowly, his voice a whisper meant only for his niece. "We will say nothing," he murmured. "Not a single word." From that night on, silence became their armor. Every evening the officer would come down after supper, stand by the fire, and speak as if to himself about music, about France, about the absurd beauty of war, and the hope for peace. And every evening, the girl would sit by the lamp, her eyes fixed on her needle, her lips pressed shut. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, whispering through the cracks like the breath of the sea. Inside, 3 lives shared one roof, one man bound by orders, one woman bound by silence, and one fragile thread of humanity stretched between them. As the days passed, that silence would soon weigh heavier than any weapon, shaping a story that no bullet could erase. The first nights passed like a ritual carved into stone. Each evening, the German officer would appear at the same hour, descend the wooden staircase, and pause at the edge of the firelight. He would remove his gloves, straighten his posture, and speak in a calm, thoughtful tone as if giving a lecture to ghosts. He spoke of his love for France, of its poets and painters, of the bridges over the Seine and the music of Debussy. His French carried the accent of a man who had studied it carefully, almost tenderly. "It is a land of soul," he said one evening, his eyes soft with memory. "If only our 2 nations could share what is beautiful instead of what is brutal." "Lev." The old man said nothing. The girl continued to sew beneath the glow of the lamp, her fingers moving with quiet rhythm. The only answers he received were the crackling of wood and the ticking of the wall clock. Yet Werner never seemed offended. He would smile faintly, speak for a while longer, then wish them good night before returning upstairs. Outside, the winter deepened. The village lay under a blanket of snow, and the soldiers who patrolled its streets became part of the landscape, gray shadows among gray stones. Inside the house, the silence grew denser, heavier. The old man began writing each night in a small notebook, recording every word the officer said, every gesture, every attempt to be kind. "He believes in peace," he wrote, "but peace is not his to give." Lo. One morning, while hanging laundry in the small courtyard, the girl saw Werner speaking to a group of children near the well. He gave them pieces of chocolate from his pocket and showed one boy how to carve a small wooden bird. When he looked up and saw her watching, he nodded politely. She turned away without a word, yet her hands trembled as she clipped the sheets to the line. That evening, Werner spoke again about music. "When I was a boy," he said, standing by the fire, "my father played the cello every Sunday morning. Even during the hunger years, he played. I thought that if I could make something beautiful, I could not belong to evil. He paused, looking toward the girl, though she did not raise her eyes. Do you understand what I mean? Her needle slipped, pricking her finger. A small drop of blood fell onto the white fabric. She said nothing, only pressed her hand against the cloth and kept sewing. Werner smiled sadly. Yes, he said quietly, I see that you do. The days followed one another with the same restrained rhythm. He spoke, they listened. The house breathed in silence. Yet beneath that surface, something was changing. The officer's voice softened, and the bitterness in his eyes began to fade. He no longer looked like a conqueror, but like a man trying to find his place in a world that had lost its reason. One night, when the wind was howling outside and the fire burned low, Werner stopped speaking of art and turned to the old man. I know my uniform offends you, he said, but believe me, I wear it with sorrow. I came here believing our war would bring order. Now I see it brings only grief. He hesitated, then added, Still, I wish to be worthy of your silence. No one answered. The clock struck 9. Werner bowed his head slightly and left the room. When his footsteps faded upstairs, the old man looked at his niece. He is different, he whispered. The girl did not reply, but for the first time since the officer arrived, her needle stopped moving. She sat still, staring at the doorway where he had stood, the faint smell of his tobacco still lingering in the air. Outside, snow fell without sound, soft as ash. Inside, 3 people shared the same silence, no longer out of defiance alone, but out of something neither side could name. The house had become a fragile bridge between enemies, built not with words, but with endurance. Winter turned to early spring, though the air still carried the weight of frost. The snow outside the windows began to melt into narrow streams that traced the stone walls like veins. The days had become quieter in the village, yet tension pulsed beneath that calm. German flags hung on the square, and posters of propaganda covered the market stalls where no one dared to linger. Inside the old house, life followed the same restrained rhythm. Each evening, Lieutenant Werner von Ebernack came down at the same hour, his uniform pressed, his hair perfectly combed. He spoke of art, of the books that had shaped his soul, of the dream that one day culture would unite people instead of dividing them. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it now, a kind of loneliness that even he could not disguise. Sometimes he brought flowers for the table, sometimes a record from Paris that he played softly on a small gramophone he carried with him. The music filled the space between them like a living memory. The girl sat with her sewing, her uncle near the fire, and the officer standing beside the piano. The silence they offered was still deliberate, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It had become a mirror, reflecting back his sincerity and his pain. One evening, he spoke about his home on the banks of the Rhine, about a sister who painted landscapes and a mother who prayed every morning for her son's soul. She believes that goodness can survive even in darkness, he said quietly. I want to believe that too. His eyes turned toward the girl. When you sit there without speaking, I do not feel judged. I feel forgiven. The girl looked down, pretending to fix her thread, but her hand trembled. Her uncle noticed the slight movement and turned another page of his book, though he was no longer reading. Later that night, after Werner had gone upstairs, the old man closed the notebook where he recorded everything. His words are not lies, he said softly, but he serves a lie. The girl nodded without lifting her eyes. He does not see it yet. Days passed, and the tone of the officer's voice began to change. He spoke less of philosophy and more of the war itself, the things he had seen, the things he could not change. There are villages like yours everywhere, he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper, each filled with silence, each hiding its grief. Sometimes I wonder if we will drown in all that silence before the war ends. That night, as he turned to leave, his gaze lingered on the girl. For the first time, she looked up. Their eyes met for a single breath, no words, no smile, only recognition. Then he bowed slightly and walked upstairs, leaving her heart trembling in the still air. The next morning, the sound of marching boots echoed through the street. A convoy of soldiers passed the house, shouting orders and laughter. Werner did not join them. He remained by the window, watching through the curtain. The old man saw him there, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. When Werner noticed the old man's reflection in the glass, he turned and said quietly, I did not come here to conquer you. I came to understand you. Perhaps that was my mistake. The old man did not respond, but something in his gaze softened. That evening, the gramophone stayed silent. Werner sat near the fire instead, his voice low and hesitant. "Do you ever believe," he asked, "that silence can be holy?" No one answered, but the girl's eyes glistened in the light. She reached for her cup of tea, and her hand brushed the edge of his glove on the table. He drew back quickly, almost startled by the contact. He stood, straightened his coat, and said in a voice that trembled slightly, "Thank you for letting me speak here. Even if you never answer, you have given me more peace than my own country." He left them in that dim room, the fire dying low. The girl watched the shadows flicker against the wall and realized that silence had changed shape. It was no longer the language of resistance, it had become the space where empathy was born. The first light of April fell through the narrow window panes, turning the dust in the air into drifting silver. The war had not ended, but the rhythm of it had slowed into a kind of uneasy breathing. In the village, people spoke in whispers again, daring to hope that the world might one day return to reason. But inside the old stone house, the silence between three souls had grown into something unspoken and profound. Werner von Ebernack no longer arrived with flowers or records. The gramophone sat silent, and the vase on the mantel held only wilted stems from weeks before. He seemed changed, thinner, as if carrying a weight that even his straight posture could not disguise. He still greeted them politely every evening, his boots polished, his uniform immaculate, but the warmth had faded from his eyes. That night, the old man read near the fire, and the girl sat at her table with her sewing untouched. Werner entered quietly, removing his gloves with care. He stood for a moment, looking at them as if memorizing their faces, then said, "I must leave soon. They are sending me to Paris for a conference with the High Command. I am told it concerns the future of France." Talba, the old man did not move. The girl's fingers gripped her needle until it bent slightly. Werner looked at the flames, his voice lower. "I once thought I could speak for understanding, that words could build bridges. But now I am not sure whether words have ever changed anything." He gave a tired smile. "Perhaps silence is wiser than I knew." He left earlier than usual that night. The house felt colder after he went upstairs. The old man looked at his niece. "He has begun to see," he said. She said nothing, but her eyes glistened in the dim firelight. Days passed without news. The air carried the faint scent of wet soil as the snow melted completely. Then, one afternoon, the rumble of an engine stopped outside the gate. Werner returned, but something in his presence had shifted. His uniform was dusted with travel grime, and his expression was that of a man who had looked directly into the heart of despair. That evening, he spoke not of art or peace. He spoke of what he had heard in Paris. "They spoke of order," he said bitterly, "of cleansing, of a new world built on ashes. I thought we came to build something noble, but what they plan is destruction, nothing more." His voice trembled. "France will not be a partner. It will be a servant. And I cannot be part of that." The old man closed his book. "You know now what your silence costs us," he said quietly. Werner nodded. "Yes, but it costs me too. I am ashamed that I once called this conquest peace." He looked toward the girl. "You have never spoken to me, but I have heard you all the same. Every night your silence has said, 'We do not hate you. We only mourn what you have become.'" The girl's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her eyes filled with something that was neither pity nor forgiveness, but recognition. Werner straightened his coat. "Tomorrow, I will request reassignment to the front. I cannot remain a guest in a house that has shown me what honor looks like. Perhaps I will not return. But if I do not, please remember me as a man who tried to learn too late." He bowed to them both, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards, and left the room without another word. That night, the old man wrote a final note in his small book. He came as a conqueror and left as a man. The next morning, when the first sunlight broke across the courtyard, the girl stood by the window and saw the officer walking down the road, his overcoat buttoned, his figure small against the horizon. The wind carried the faint echo of a train whistle from far away. She remained there long after he had vanished from sight, her hand resting on the cold glass. Outside, the world was waking again. But inside, silence reigned solemn, eternal, and filled with meaning. Days turned into weeks, and the house seemed larger without the sound of boots crossing the floor above. The old man still kept to his chair by the fire, though the evenings had grown warmer. The girl worked quietly beside him, yet her movements had lost their rhythm. The silence that once felt like defiance now felt like absence. Every night, she found herself glancing toward the stairs, expecting to hear the creak of a step, the soft clearing of a throat, or the deep, careful voice that had once filled the space between them. But there was only the faint hum of the wind through the shutters. The war outside the village grew louder. Convoys passed more often, soldiers shouted orders, and the echo of distant gunfire reached them like thunder rolling across miles of sky. Rumors whispered through the street. Some said the Allied forces were advancing. Others said the Germans would burn the villages before retreating. Still, the old man and his niece kept their routine, their resistance reduced to endurance. One evening, a young soldier stopped by their gate. His uniform was the same gray, but his face was new and nervous. He handed the old man an envelope sealed in black wax. "It is from Lieutenant von Ebernack," he said quietly. He asked that it be delivered if he did not return. The soldier saluted awkwardly and left without waiting for thanks. Inside, the old man opened the envelope. The paper was thin and folded twice. The handwriting was precise but unsteady. He read aloud in a low voice. "To my hosts, whose silence has taught me more than any book, I write from the front. It is quiet here except for the wind. I used to believe silence was emptiness, but now I know it can also be grace. I hope that when this war ends, your country will forgive those who tried, even if we failed. I go now to stand where I should have stood from the beginning among men who do not hide behind orders. If you ever hear music carried by the sea, think of it as my farewell." The old man folded the letter carefully and handed it to his niece. She held it in both hands, unable to speak. That night, she placed the letter beside the small vase on the mantel and lit a single candle. The flame flickered gently, throwing soft shadows across the room. Days later, news spread that the lieutenant's unit had been destroyed in combat near the eastern border. There were no survivors. The girl listened to the words without moving, her eyes fixed on the candle's flame. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. He kept his promise. The old man looked at her and nodded. Yes, he left as he came with honor. Ardo. That night, as the village lay under curfew, she opened the window of her room. The air was cool and smelled of the sea. She placed the letter on the sill and let the wind lift its corner. Somewhere far away, a bell tolled. Her thoughts drifted back to his last words, the way he had stood in the doorway, his hand over his heart, his eyes full of apology. She closed her eyes and said softly, "I hear you now." Downstairs, the old man closed his notebook for the final time. On its last page, he wrote, "The silence remains, but it no longer divides us. It remembers him." Outside, the night deepened, carrying the sound of waves against unseen shores. In that small house, a single candle burned, until dawn, a quiet light for a man who had come to conquer and found redemption instead. Months passed. The war that had swallowed Europe began to lose its roar. The occupying troops grew restless. Rumors of defeat spread like smoke through the villages. One morning, the first Allied planes crossed the sky, their engines trembling the glass of the old stone house. People ran into the streets and whispered prayers of relief. For the first time in years, the tricolor flags of France appeared again in windows and on rooftops. Inside the house, the old man stood by the same window where he had once watched the officer depart. His hands rested on the sill, rough and trembling. The girl, no longer sewing, was packing small bundles of clothes and papers for the villagers who were fleeing the final clashes. The silence in the house had changed again. It no longer carried fear or loss, but the stillness of survival. When the liberation came, soldiers in new uniforms arrived, smiling and shouting in French. They asked questions, inspected every house, and took down names. The officer in charge, a young man with a sharp jaw and clean boots, stopped when he saw the old man and his niece. "You lived here with a German officer, did you not?" he asked. The old man nodded. "Yes," he said calmly. "Lieutenant von Ebernack." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Then you collaborated?" "No," the old man answered. "We resisted him with silence." The young soldier frowned but said nothing more. He wrote something in his notebook and moved on. When he was gone, the girl closed the door and leaned against it, her breath shaking. "It is over," she said softly. The old man looked around the small room, the worn furniture, the fading wallpaper, the empty mantel where the letter had once lain. "No," he replied quietly, "it is never over, but perhaps it can begin again." In the days that followed, they cleaned the house. The candle wax had hardened into white streaks on the table, and the gramophone, silent for months, was still in its corner. One afternoon, as the girl dusted the shelves, she found a folded sheet of paper tucked between two books. It was written in German, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was a piece of music notes drawn with care, titled in French, "Pour celle qui se tait," for the one who is silent. She carried it to the piano and placed it gently on the stand. The keys were slightly out of tune, but she pressed one anyway. The sound was faint, pure, trembling like a memory. The old man looked up from his chair as the melody filled the room. "He wrote this for you," he said. She nodded. "For us?" she whispered. The song rose and fell, simple and human, like the murmur of the sea beyond the hills. When the last note faded, she closed the piano lid and sat for a long time in silence. That night, she went to the edge of the village where the fields met the cliffs. The sky above was clear, and the sea below shimmered with pale light. She took the officer's letter from her coat pocket, read it once more, and let it fall into the wind. The paper drifted down, caught the breeze, and vanished into the darkness. Behind her, the bells of the village began to ring slow, solemn, free. She turned toward the sound and walked home. The war was over. The silence that had once been their shield was now their peace. Inside the house, the old man sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one. He thought of the soldier who had come to conquer and the woman who had never spoken a word. Together, they had proven that even in the darkest times, dignity could speak louder than any voice. Summer came, and with it the weight of rebuilding. The war had ended, but its echo lingered in every brick, every silence, every breath. The village slowly awakened from years of fear. Men returned from camps, women reopened shops, children played again in the square where soldiers once marched. Yet, for the old man and his niece, life resumed in quieter tones. Their house, though worn, stood untouched, a witness to both oppression and grace. Each morning, the girl tended to the garden that had gone wild during the occupation. She planted flowers along the path, their colors bright against the gray stones. The old man repaired shutters, mended chairs, and swept away dust that had settled like memory. They spoke little, not because they feared words, but because they no longer needed them. Silence had become their language of peace. One afternoon, as she was watering the small garden, a group of French officers stopped near the gate. Their jeep bore the insignia of the new command. The leading officer, polite but firm, asked if they had once housed a German lieutenant. The girl hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "Werner von Ebernack." The officer removed his cap. "We found his name in a field hospital's record. He died in combat, as you may already know. But among his belongings, there was a journal. It mentions you both." He handed her a small notebook bound in brown leather. "It belongs to you, if you wish to keep it." The girl accepted it with both hands. Her uncle thanked the man, who nodded respectfully before leaving. The engine of the jeep faded down the road, leaving behind a thin trail of dust that sparkled in the afternoon light. Inside, they opened the journal together. The pages were filled with precise handwriting in German and French, alternating between reflections and fragments of poetry. One passage caught the old man's eye. "If I could return to that house, I would not speak so much. I would listen. I would let their silence teach me what my country has forgotten, that respect is the highest form of love." The girl touched the ink gently, as if it were still warm. On the last page, there was a rough drawing of the small house with light in its windows and two figures seated by the fire. Beneath it, he had written, "For those who never spoke, yet said everything." That night, the girl placed the journal on the mantel beside the vase and the photograph of her parents. The candlelight flickered across the page, making the drawing appear to move, as if the soldier's hand were still alive somewhere beyond time. Later, as she stood by the window, the old man spoke softly. "His words have found their way back home." She nodded. He wanted to understand us. Perhaps he finally did. Beyond the fields, the sea shimmered under the moonlight, vast and calm. A breeze entered the room, lifting the curtains slightly, carrying the faint scent of salt and summer grass. The girl whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe forgiveness is not spoken, maybe it is lived." The old man closed his eyes. "Then live it," he said. "Live it for him, and for all who never could." The night deepened, and the house once again settled into silence, no longer heavy, no longer painful, but sacred. The journal remained open on the mantel, its final words glowing faintly in the light. Peace begins when silence is no longer empty. Arbod. Outside, the waves rolled against the cliffs, steady and eternal, like a promise kept. Autumn returned with a softness that wrapped the village in gold and gray. The war was now a story told in hushed tones, a wound slowly closing but never quite healed. The house at the edge of town stood quiet among the falling leaves, its windows reflecting the pale sky. Inside, the old man and his niece had found rhythm again, though the silence still carried the faint echo of a voice long gone. Each morning, she walked to the cliffs overlooking the sea, carrying a small notebook, the one Werner had left behind. She would sit on a flat stone, the wind tugging at her scarf, and read a few lines. Sometimes she wrote beneath his words, adding her own reflections in the margins. It was not love in the romantic sense that bound her to his memory. It was recognition, a connection between two people who had met on opposite sides of a war and discovered something that neither flag could define. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the horizon, she returned home to find her uncle preparing a simple meal. He looked older now, his hands slower, but his eyes carried the same quiet strength. "The mayor came today," he said. "They want me to speak at the ceremony next week. They will honor those who resisted during the occupation." She set the notebook on the table. "You should speak," she said gently. The old man smiled faintly. "And what should I say?" "That our greatest act of defiance was to say nothing." She looked at him with calm conviction. Sometimes silence is the only language truth can trust. The following week, the village gathered in the square. Flags fluttered in the cool wind, and the church bells rang slowly. The old man stood before a small crowd of neighbors, soldiers, and children. His voice was steady as he spoke. "We lived through dark years. Many fought with words or weapons. We fought with silence. It was not easy, and it was not cowardice. It was the only way we could remain human in the face of inhumanity." When the ceremony ended, the girl placed a single white flower at the base of the memorial. Beneath her hand, she slipped a folded page from Werner's journal. It read, "May those who listen build the world again." That night, back in their home, she sat by the fire with the notebook in her lap. The old man had gone to bed. The clock ticked softly on the mantel, and the sea could be heard faintly beyond the hills. She turned to a blank page and began to write. "He came into our home wearing the uniform of an enemy, yet he left it a man searching for peace. His words, once heavy with duty, became prayers whispered into the quiet. If history remembers him only as a soldier, then history will have missed the point." She closed the book and rested it beside the vase. For a long moment, she stared at the flames dancing in the hearth, the orange light touching the worn floorboards where he had once stood. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like the breath of the sea returning home. It carried no bitterness, no sorrow, only a deep calm, the kind that follows understanding. The girl whispered a single word, her voice steady and sure. "Peace." The sound drifted upward, filling the room that had once known only silence. For the first time in years, that silence felt answered, like music completing its final note. Winter returned once more, quiet and gray. The fields around the village lay bare, and the sea below the cliffs moved slowly under the pale sky. Years had passed since the officer's last footsteps echoed in that house, yet his presence lingered like the scent of old wood after rain. The war had become history, but for those who lived through it, memory never truly slept. The girl, now a woman, tended to her uncle with care. His hair had turned white, his steps slower, but his eyes remained sharp. On the mantel still rested the notebook and the vase, now filled with dried flowers that had kept their shape long after their color had faded. The piano stood silent in the corner, yet every time she passed it, she felt the urge to lift the lid, to play the melody that had once filled the house with something more powerful than words. One evening, as snow began to fall again, the old man sat by the fire and looked at his niece. "Do you still think of him?" he asked gently. She nodded, not as a soldier, as a man who tried to listen. The old man smiled faintly. "Then you have forgiven him." "I do not know if forgiveness is the right word," she replied, "but I remember him without anger. Perhaps that is enough." Outside, the wind swept across the roof, carrying the soft sound of the sea. The woman rose, opened the window slightly, and let the cold air enter the room. She closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the church tower. Its echo mingled with the sound of waves below, the same rhythm that had once filled the long nights of silence. She turned back to the fire, her gaze falling upon the notebook. Slowly, she opened it to the last page where she had written her own words. The ink had faded, but the meaning remained clear. Beneath her handwriting, she added one final line. "The silence of the sea never ends, but within it, we learned how to hear each other." The old man watched her write, his expression peaceful. "That is how stories should end," he said quietly. "Not with victory or defeat, but with understanding." Later that night, after he had gone to rest, she sat alone beside the window. Snowflakes drifted across the glass like whispers from another time. She thought of the soldier's voice, his quiet sincerity, and the look in his eyes when he had spoken of beauty and peace. The memory no longer hurt. It simply existed, like the tide eternal, calm, inevitable. Before going to bed, she placed the notebook in a small wooden box along with the officer's letter and the folded piece of music. She closed the lid gently, as if sealing a prayer. The fire dimmed. The house returned to stillness. Outside, the sea murmured against the cliffs, unending and vast. In that silence, the same silence that had once been resistance, grief, and love, there was now only peace. The story of a man who came to conquer and a woman who never spoke had become part of the wind, part of the sea, part of the quiet song that carries on long after every voice has faded.